Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zipporah, and I am a member of 1919 Magazine. And I just want to thank everyone for coming to our teaching on the Horn of Africa, which is done in collaboration with your University of Toronto's African Student Course Union. We're really happy that you're sharing this virtual space with us, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about our organization, 1919. So 1919 is an independent arts and multimedia platform for Black cultural production, Black political education, internationalist solidarity, and imagination. We publish a print magazine each year, and we actually just released our fifth issue of Free Dreams. We also host a SoundCloud radio for independent DJs and scholars alike, designed to give us a platform for local musicians, as well as provide an avenue to ground and connect all of our projects as fundamentally rooted in anti-colonial resistance and cooperative community power. We tend to combine our artwork and community-oriented grassroots actions to ensure that our political philosophy remains grounded in love and respect for the community. We are guided by principles of anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, abolitionism, and
Awesome. Thanks, Zipporah. I'm gonna go ahead and start with our land acknowledgement. We would like to begin by acknowledging the indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between peoples and to improve our own understanding of local indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, in Turtle Island, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people that have been here for thousands of years and many generations. We would also like to acknowledge and take a brief moment of silence to recognize the thousands of unmarked graves of Indigenous children found at former residential school sites across what we now call Canada. We stand in solidarity with and call for justice against the ongoing colonial violence and trauma inflicted on Indigenous peoples on their own land by Canada, the US, and the Catholic Church. And I'll pause for a moment. Specifically, here in Calgary, also known as Mohkinstsis, we acknowledge the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, Stoney Nakoda First Nations, the Chiniki, Bearspaw, Wesley, and the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3, and all the people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. And I'll pass it back to Zipporah to read some community agreements for the event.
thank you, Caleb. So this discussion that we are going to have today is going to cover a lot of topics that are deemed sensitive and can be emotionally charged conversations within our community. We wish to have these discussions that can hold space for the complexities and differences of the region with dignity and respect. This event is going to be rooted in a desire to basically generate conversation on how we can critically engage in regional politics, specifically within the Horn of Africa, and also from the diaspora through basically anti-imperialist principles. We hope that by hosting this event that we can basically listen and learn from each other. And we invite you all to embrace curiosity with how we understand conflict and oppression within the Horn of Africa. And I just want to conclude by saying that since this is an emotionally charged and can be sensitive, we want to say that this space has zero tolerance for disrespectful speech or behavior that are oppressive in nature. But I believe the YouTube comments should be off, so hopefully we won't run into those issues.
Awesome, thanks, Zipporah. And just a quick description of the event. So big thank you to our speakers for participating in this timely and critical conversation as educators. And thank you to our community for sharing time with us today to listen, learn, and ask questions. Our intention with this conversation is to provide our community with an interdisciplinary roundtable discussion and teaching that analyzes the multiple and intersecting crises currently going on in the region today. Our hope is to provide alternative and rigorous forms of political education that encourage critical engagement from the international Black diaspora. We have also seen statements and discourse on the Horn of Africa in recent weeks that fall severely short on what the anti-imperialist, class-conscious, anti-war, and anti-intervention positions should be. Although our discussion has been in the works for numerous months, we also see an opportunity for this teaching to offer a restorative and corrective response designed to address the shortcomings we have witnessed in anti-imperialist discourse when discussing the Horn of Africa region. We will end our teaching discussing how we in the diaspora can think, imagine, and be in solidarity with those fighting for liberation and justice in the Horn of Africa. Yes, our panelists today will discuss prompts given to them relating to questions about the past, present, and future of the region that historicize conflicts that plague our present day. Our moderator, which is myself, I'll ask each speaker different questions, and each panelist will get approximately 5 to 10 minutes to answer each question. And then afterwards, there will be a Q&A featuring selected questions submitted by attendees before the event. We will answer as many questions as possible. But now that's it for us. I'd like to ask the speakers to introduce themselves. So maybe first I'll ask Samuel to go ahead.
Thanks, Khalid. So my name is Alemayehu Tsegai, and I am a third-year PhD student in history at Queen's University, and my research interest is broadly in Ethiopian historical geography and nationalism. My current dissertation project is focused on examining the pre-modern Abyssinian discourse on place, space, territoriality, borders and boundaries, and sovereignty, and its encounter with Western conceptions of space, territoriality, and sovereignty at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of 20th centuries. I'm also interested in narrative nationalism and the discourse of decolonization and modernity during the British military administration between 1942 and 1952. That's a decade. Yeah. Is that enough of an introduction?
Yes, thanks, Samuel. I'll ask Nisrin to go next.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nisrin Elamin. I'm an assistant professor of international studies at Bryn Mawr College. So I'm zooming in from Philadelphia, which is also occupied Lenape land. And my research focuses broadly on the impact of foreign land grabs in Central Sudan, where I'm from, on sort of community resistance to foreign land grabs, on extractive industries, and on migrant justice. I sort of look at the ways that the southern borders, I should say the northern border of Sudan with Libya and Egypt, and also the southern border of Mexico and Guatemala are kind of being reconceptualized by the US and by Europe, respectively, as their southern borders. Thank you. I'm excited to be here, and I should say I'm not an expert really on Sudan, so I'm really excited also to learn from everybody else here.
Absolutely, thank you. That was wonderful. I'll ask Sabine to go next.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you so much to the team of 1919 for inviting me today. I'm really excited to be here among you all. And yeah, as Nisrin already said, to kind of learn from these conversations as well. I actually just finished my PhD at the University of Heidelberg in anthropology. And so it's really very fresh, I think just 3 weeks ago. I'm going to be an incoming postdoctoral bridge to faculty fellow at the Department of Anthropology at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And so my work is more broadly at the intersection of urban renewal, forms of racialization, Blackness, and new forms of emergent empire in the Horn of Africa.
Awesome, thank you. And lastly, I'll ask Alemayehu, could you introduce yourself next?
Thank you very much, Khalid, and all members of 1919 for organizing this event. My name is Alemayehu Weldemariam. I'm an Ethiopian American. I am what you call the typical jack of all trades, but a master of none. I have a degree in law from Addis Ababa University and graduate level training in philosophy from George Mason University, classics and philosophy, the great books from St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, 2 graduate degrees in conflict analysis and peace studies from George Mason University and European University for Peace Studies. I teach constitutional law at Maryland University and have been teaching different things at various universities here in the United States. So I'm based between Ethiopia and the United States.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you to everybody for situating yourselves and your work on this panel. We're all excited to listen and learn. And I'll also add that our last panelist, Safia Aidid, couldn't make it today due to illness. We're saddened to not have her join us today, but we're definitely sending her best wishes, lots of love to recover. But yeah, with that being said, I will get into our first question, and this will be for Samuel. How does the Horn of Africa's history with colonialism impact the region presently? What are the major impacts of the colonial legacies left by European colonists such as the UK, France, and Italy? How do they still exercise this power today?
Okay, Caleb, thank you. I have prepared the notes and written notes, so I'm going to read from my note, if you don't mind, because that is more comfortable for me. So to start answering the question, I will start with the obvious, and that is like all African states, the states in the Horn of Africa, at least in their present form, are the product of European colonialism. Colonialism inaugurated the formation of states in the Horn of Africa, violently reordered the political geographies of the region, and ensured the intensive and expansive articulation of the Horn of Africa to global capitalist economic order. And secondly, directly related to the point that I have just raised, the current contentious interstate boundaries in the Horn of Africa were drawn by European colonial forces with an active participation of the Abyssinian state, which engaged in its own violent imperial expansion at the end of the 19th century, suppressing and subjugating communities that had their own independent political systems. So if you look at the bigger historical context, and if we take a long-duration perspective, the intra and the interstate conflict in the Horn of Africa, the direct legacies of European and regional colonialism, the long-drawn conflict between Somalia and Ethiopia, for instance, Ethiopia and Sudan, Ethiopia and Eritrea, Eritrea and Djibouti are all related to the colonially constructed borderlands. Those conflict hotspots along the interstate borderlands continue to disproportionately affect people along the borderlands and produce millions of refugees as a result. Conventionally, Ethiopia is considered to be an exception to the colonial rule, and one can concede that the history of the formation of the Ethiopian state has its own unique aspect, in that an indigenous Abyssinian state was an active participant in the crafting of the Ethiopian empire state. However, the formation of the Ethiopian state as politically delimited and cartographically fixed entity is located in the historical nexus of capitalist and imperial expansion in the Horn of Africa at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Another enduring legacy that I can talk about European colonialism in the Horn of Africa is the transplantation, superimposition of the modular Westphalian nation state at the most desirable, normatively superior political framework, to the realization and preservation of which all political energies and imaginations are invested. Violence of the worst kind is unleashed, the current violence as an example. Economies are stunted, famine and genocidal wars are encouraged. For the last century or so, the main political energy in the Horn of Africa has been consumed in the preservation of colonially constructed nation states to the detriment of other worthy emancipatory political projects and at the expenses of other modes of being and relationalities. The singular state-centric focus has stifled political imagination, co-opted, corrupted, and perverted traditional institutions with democratic potential, foreclosed progressive and independent transnational politics of solidarity in the Horn of Africa. And this, in a broader way, genealogically, I trace it to European colonialism and this impact. Reading with Manu Goswami, I would also like to discuss how, in relation to the imposition of the nation state as an ideal political framework, an ensemble of institutions and practices of statecraft that consolidated territorially fixed, spatially bounded nation states were also introduced by colonialism, and still we are grappling with the effect of these institutions and practices. These institutions and practices, statecraft practices, included demarcation, mapping, and policing of national territorial boundaries, the expansion and interpenetration of society by state institutions such as the army, schools, public bureaucracies, and all this I am again related to European colonialism and their long enduring legacies, not necessarily directly related, but in a more complex genealogical way can be traced to European colonialism. Another practices which statecraft practices as part of the things that I'm listing that we can trace to colonialism would be the formation of a vast territorially integrated network of communication infrastructure, especially in places like Eritrea, Somalia. You can trace all this back to the colonial period. The appropriation and designation and enclosure of natural resources as a sovereign state space, and practices of spatial and economic planning that took a demarcated national territory as a target and framework of development, and the creation of nationalized built environment in the form of capital cities, monuments, official cemeteries, museums, and parks that works as places of state-mediated collective memory, which made visible the affective liaisons between territory, history, and collective identity. All this we can maybe have different sources, but I say the main sources for all these practices and institutions can be traced to the colonial period. Underpinning the formation and consolidation of the nation states in the Horn, a process which is still ongoing, is a tendency towards homogenization, hegemony, mastery, domination of societies in a manner which usually necessitates the employment of catastrophic violence, and all this can be also as well related to European colonialism and its legacies in the Horn of Africa. And in one way or the other, all this could be genealogically traced again to European colonialism. In the afterlife of colonialism in the Horn of Africa, that is in the decolonization process or in the decolonization period, the Horn of Africa didn't stop being a playground for imperialist and Zionist forces. The United States at one time, and the UK, Israel, and the Soviet Union. This is before the end of the Cold War I'm talking about. The states in the Horn of Africa have been willing mercenaries of capital and empire. The ruling elite and their useful intellectual elites have been very instrumental in playing comprador bourgeois and as intermediaries of capital and empire for the last century or so. During the Cold War, after the Cold War, and the so-called now presently war on terror, the countries in the Horn of Africa have been really very, again, mercenaries of empire and capital. If you take Djibouti, it's basically essentially a garrison state where everybody's has erected military bases. France and United States and China have military bases in Djibouti. Ethiopia has always been a client state, first for the United States and then later for the Soviet Union, and then after the end of the Cold War again for the West. Eritrea, with all its gimmicks, anti-imperialist gimmicks, in reality have been also willing servant of the West at one point, especially at the beginning of the war on terror. In the early 2000s, the Eritrean government was willing to give the United States a military base, even though the United States didn't proceed with that. And the Eritrean government has been also very cooperative with the United States, to the extent that it was sending army to as far as the Republic of Congo in the 1997 at the behest of the United States. So aside from despite its theatrics, anti-imperialist theatrics, the Eritrean government is also it's also willing partner of Western countries. So this is in a more incoherent way what I want to say about colonialism and its legacies and its current reiterations, and how the states in the Horn of Africa have been always in cahoots with empire and capital.
Thank you, Samuel. That was a wonderful start. A lot of great things there, especially talking about colonialism as this ongoing and enduring system with legacies and a genealogy that has surpassed independence, any symbolic symbols of independence. Thank you. The next question in our this is still in the past, examining the past of the Horn of Africa region, is how have modern iterations of empire and regional colonialism manifested in life today? How has this been mapped out across wealth, class, ethnicity, and land divisions in your region of experience or expertise? And for this question, we'll have Nisrin and Sabine discuss.
Great. So thank you so much, Samuel, for that really helpful historical overview. I'm going to be kind of zoning in a little bit more on Sudan and specifically on land, because that's kind of my area of expertise. So forgive me for not giving a sort of as beautiful of an overview as Samuel just did. But yeah, in my work, I look at the impact of foreign land grabs on rural farming communities in central Sudan, where I'm from. And in particular, I look at the different strategies, forms of resistance, political organizing, that different landless and landholding people are using to reclaim lands that were seized by the state under a set of land laws whose initial architects were British colonial officials. And so they used those laws to extract cotton and other cash crops to fuel their industrial revolution. The modern Sudanese state, then first under Nimeri, and after that under al-Bashir, have used these laws to seize lands they consider to be unproductive, such as herding and grazing land, but also rain-fed farming land and even smallholder farms that are using mechanized farming techniques. So to kind of bring this into the present, since the mid-2000s, in an effort to offset losses in oil revenue that would accompany South Sudan's likely secession, the Sudanese government and elites within that government in particular began using these lands to attract foreign agribusiness and real estate investors, mainly from the Middle East. So Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Jordan, Turkey, Syria, etc. So what we've seen in areas like the Jazeera, which is situated in this very fertile Nile Delta between the White and Blue Niles, but also parts of the north, east, and south of the country, is Gulf investors leasing vast tracts of land that local farmers and pastoralists have been using for generations to grow crops for dairy and meat production. And these crops are very water intensive. So they deplete the soil and underground water aquifers, and they're then mostly exported to the Gulf to feed cows and to produce dairy and meat products. Just to give you a sense of the scale or scope of this, there are about 32 large-scale land deals for over 5 million acres of Sudanese land that have been signed over the last decade between Sudanese government elites and foreign investors for lease periods ranging from 20 to 99 years. And of those investors, Saudi and Emirati companies have signed over 15 deals for over 1 million acres of land, which means that these companies now own more Sudanese land than all of Sudan's domestic investors combined. And Prime Minister Hamdok, who is sort of the leader of the civilian component of our transitional government, who's an economist and former UN diplomat, seems to be a big proponent of this model of investment, right? Linking it to increased food security. But of course, what we've seen on the ground is that, and small farmers will tell you this, is that actually food security is really dependent on small farmers retaining, not losing access to land, and to the state continuing to support rather than withdraw its support from smallholder farmers who make up basically the backbone of the economy. And so who gets dispossessed, how that dispossession takes place, and which elites in Sudan are doing the dispossessing, if you will, has a lot to do not only with class, but also with gender and race. And it's shaped by Sudan's unique history of imperialism, slavery, and Arab conquest. The history of land enclosures and dispossession in Sudan is in some parts of the country incredibly violent, and access to Sudanese land has always been racialized, classed, and gendered. In Darfur, for instance, we saw how genocidal state violence facilitated a state-driven resource and land grab, as millions of Darfurians were murdered or violently displaced from areas that were mineral rich. You now have gold mining concessions granted to South African, British, and Russian companies in some of these areas that people were forced to flee from. And Hemedti, who's one of the top officials in Sudan's transitional government, the sort of military wing of the government, and also the leader of the Rapid Support Forces, formerly known as the Janjaweed who carried out the genocidal state violence I was talking about in Darfur, he owns several of the gold mines in North Darfur. And there's a continuity here between state violence facilitating resource grabs in marginalized areas of the country that the Jazeera, being in central Sudan, has mostly been shielded from because of race, ethnicity, and access to political and economic power, at least to the elites who hold political and economic power in the country. So the final point I want to make is that for the Gulf elites who are establishing agribusiness farms on Sudanese land, this is not only about land, but about establishing themselves as a regional hegemon and kind of reconceptualizing the Muslim world or ummah with themselves at the political and economic and spiritual center. So land is a way for them to funnel money into the pockets of key elites in exchange for particular concessions. Sudan, like other countries in the Horn, have sent troops, for instance, many of whom belong to the Rapid Support Forces, to fight the war in Yemen on Saudi Arabia and the UAE's behalf. And in exchange, the UAE and Saudi Arabia have lobbied on Sudan's behalf in Washington to be removed from the Muslim ban and state sponsors of terrorism lists. In other words, land is also doing another kind of work here to solidify these relationships between Sudanese and Gulf elites and to strengthen Gulf influence in the region. And the Gulf are, of course, not the only actors trying to control Sudanese politics. You have the European Union, which funded the former regime to militarize its northern border to prevent migrants from entering Libya to the tune of about 250 million euros. And while this program has temporarily been suspended, it was basically used to legitimize and prop up the Rapid Support Forces. I also think we have to think of Sudan's gradual pivot towards Egypt in relation to the Gerd Dam and its recent move to send troops to reclaim the Al-Fashaga region and to evict Ethiopian farmers in kind of within this context, right? What do Sudanese elites gain from these moves? Of course, the Gerd Dam, and maybe we'll discuss this a little bit later, will have, in terms of its filling, can have a negative impact on Sudanese farmers, ironically on people who have been pushed out of farming because of agribusinesses and who have moved into making bricks along the side of the Nile. And because there's not as much silt anymore with the filling of the Gerd Dam, their livelihoods are at risk. But at the same time, this sort of strengthening of their military alliance with Egypt is also about something else, right? And so we have to ask, what do elites stand to gain from it? Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Nisrin and Samuel. I think you kind of laid out quite a lot already, so I'll just try to kind of fill one of the smaller gaps by looking into Ethiopia. And actually, I think Samuel has pointed out how Europe has been really crucial in understanding the current problems in Africa when it comes to boundary making, especially in the Horn of Africa. And Nisrin has also showed that the borders between Sudan and then potentially between Tigray and Amhara regions within Ethiopia are really aftermath of these kind of treaties and colonial boundary makings. In my work, I have really kind of emphasized on looking at Ethiopia as an emergent empire, and not only to say that Ethiopia is this romanticism that we see emerging from Pan-Africanist ideologies or political imaginaries of Pan-Africanism and Black Empire, but really to see the force behind Ethiopia as this empire that is also erasing identities and always in contestation when we think about boundary making and boundaries. And we see that especially when we look at the Ethiopian-Eritrean boundary, and actually what the political imaginary for Ethiopia has been when Ethiopia looks to Eritrea and sees the port or sees the Red Sea, and therefore this kind of imaginary of expansion and transgressing its own boundaries. And I looked at infrastructure in particular, and that is, how do we understand empire in our current present? And that is, when we think about infrastructure that is always cutting across national boundaries. For one, we could say we have this example of the Gerd, the Renaissance Dam, and the contestations between Sudan, Egypt, and Ethiopia. But at the same time, we also find it when we look at the streets that are pointing to ports in Assab, coming from Addis Ababa, the capital city of Ethiopia, pointing to Eritrea, but also pointing to Djibouti. So what I did in my work is actually I looked these mega projects of structure and how the people at these social transformations are actually making sense of it. And that only works. Can you?
One moment, I think you might have froze, Sabine.
I'm sorry. I think I was cut off. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, you can continue.
Okay, I'm not really sure where I stopped. I'm apologizing. My apologies for the bad internet connection. I'm actually based in Germany. That's a country that's supposed to have better internet connection, but obviously we're not there yet. Speaking of infrastructure, but infrastructure in East Africa and the Horn of Africa, basically, I think my work is kind of highlighting the impact of these political imaginaries of infrastructural renewal that always are cutting across boundaries, and that is boundaries that are porous and always movable and flexible. That means when we look at Ethiopia, we only understand Ethiopia also by looking at Eritrea and the roads that are connecting Asmara and Addis Ababa, which was actually one of the big first promises that the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed made when he proposed a peace treaty. It wasn't the peace between people, but it was really this peace that is an imaginary of economic prosperity, infrastructure, and expansion. And one of the first promises indeed was to build a road that connects Addis Ababa and Asmara. So by looking at these kind of present imaginaries of futures that are being articulated, we only understand them by understanding certain paths that are also deeply contested, but that Ethiopia has seen itself and been articulated as this empire, not only within Ethiopia, but also within a Pan-Africanist imaginary. Yeah, and that is really crucial that we see not only Ethiopia within its own, but also Ethiopia in the world, and the Ethiopia as it has been staged itself within the League of Nations as this Black Empire, one of the only two countries within Africa that had access or was internationally recognized, but also within a Pan-Africanist imaginary and an African-American idealism that Ethiopia was indeed the place that was free of colonialism. And that actually helped foster Ethiopia being that empire and force that has subjected and subjugated a lot of its citizens. So I think that's where I would see, where we see the iterations of empire and regional colonialism, that we have to look at Ethiopia not only as this romantic vision of empire, but really as this kind of force that is also subjugating subjugating its citizens. And another iteration would be to then understand how that is trickling down to the people. And we see it, for example, that Ethiopia in the 1990s had actually tried to introduce an idea of ethnic federalism that did not try to say there's an Ethiopian identity, but really said that there's a particularity and people can come together in this kind of conglomeration within declaring themselves as ethnic subjects. That also means at the same time that Ethiopia can always expand itself, right? And so Eritrea at this kind of crossroad was always possible. It was always possible for Ethiopia to imagine Eritrea within the Ethiopian boundaries. That's of course a strong provocation, but I think we really see that come out within the recent articulations by Eritrea and the Ethiopian political leadership.
Thank you for Nisrin and Sabine discussing one like a really generative discussion on land politics and how that is infused by capital, as well as like the misleadership class in many governments in Sudan as well, discussing Ethiopia and its political imaginary in the global context, Sabine. Next, we'll move into the present, and now I think I'll pick off what you just kind of ended with, talking about the recent iterations of violence in Ethiopia between Eritrea. And I ask Alemayehu to jump in to discuss the Tigray genocide, the ensuing famine, the displacement, power shortages, and also the Ethiopian and Eritrean state involvement in this conflict. Yeah, just kind of bridging off of where Sabine finished. And yeah, just don't forget to unmute your mic.
Can you hear me now? Cool. All right, so I will be very quick on the Tigray genocide. What are the drivers of the Ethiopian Tigray war? Let me try to put in the proper context the geopolitics, in the proper context of the geopolitics of the Horn of Africa. The central driver of the war in Tigray is the threat to its constitutionally enshrined right to self-determination, posed by Abiy Ahmed and his Amhara backers. Abiy's ambition is overvaulting, and it's to continue the long discontinued goal of imperial unification and power consolidation. To take Ethiopia back to the era of absolute monarchy, one even before the adoption of the 1955 Constitution of Imperial Ethiopia. Even His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie first conceded to a constitutionally limited monarchy. In order to gain a full picture of the drivers of the conflict, it would be important to put Tigray in the proper context of the national, regional, and international security and relational dynamics. Tigray is one of the constituent 9, and very recently 10, with the addition of Sidama after the referendum, units of the 9 regional states that make up the Ethiopian Federation. Not to mention the 10th addition to the federation, namely Sidama, after a successful referendum that voted for statehood, officially known as the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia. Therefore, any attempt to figure out Ethiopia's relations with neighboring entities has to take into account the fact that it's a member of the Ethiopian Federation and that it's a regional state whose regional autonomy, if not sovereignty, has come under increasing encroachment by the federal government and the Amhara regional state after the coming to power of Abiy Ahmed. As a member of the Ethiopian Federation, Tigray needed to factor in tensions in its relations with neighboring member states of the Ethiopian Federation, such as Amhara National Regional State and Afar. With respect to Amhara, its regional frontiers has become more of a bane than a boon, insofar as Amhara has been sponsoring elements that dispute the legality of its boundaries in the southern and western fringes of its territories and the identity of its communities. To be more specific, Amhara region contests the Tigrayan identity of the land and people around Raya and Walghait. What makes this an even more complicated political and legal issue is the fact that Abiy Ahmed has been using it as a pretext for his populist politics of resentment. He panders to Amhara anti-peace elements using the language of 27 years of darkness and of rule by a minority of a 5% against a 95%. In response, to refer to the TPLF and indirectly to allude to the people of Tigray in response, Abiy has established a boundary and identity commission, usurping the power of the state councils and the House of Federation, as well as a peace and reconciliation commission, usurping the judicial powers of the courts. These acts are a clear violation of the Ethiopian constitution because the constitution has not yet been suspended or amended. He is only adding extra layers of institutions on top of what the constitution has established through unconstitutional means. Tigray, however, maintains friendly relations with the Afar national regional states, not least because the TPLF fought against the oppressive rule of the Derg along with the Afar people. Besides, the Afari and Tagaru not only share cultures, but they also enjoy a mutual history of peaceful coexistence for millennia before the outbreak of the war. It was imperative for Tigray to continue to maintain cordial relations with Afar, but it had also to find ways and means of peacefully resolving outstanding issues with the Amhara region. Since Tigray faced a double-pronged challenge stemming from Amhara and the federal government, it made Tigray look like it's struggling for its survival, rendering it an existential problem. The challenge for Tigray wasn't entirely domestic nonetheless. Tigray has been encircled by enemies since the ascension to the premiership of Abiy Ahmed. Not a siege mentality, a realist should realize that Abiy Ahmed and the Amhara region have made sure that Tigray is encircled by enemies with the rapprochement with Eritrea. Tigray has been deliberately excluded from the peacemaking process from the very outset. Therefore, the challenge for Tigray was how to break out of that encirclement. Tigray, like the rest of Ethiopia, counts on Djibouti for its imports. It was therefore important for it to realize that the great powers have turned Djibouti into a theater for rivalry. The US and China, alongside other foreign nations, maintain military bases in Djibouti. The United Arab Emirates, through DP World, and China manage and run the ports. Ethiopia issued its foreign affairs and national security policy and strategy in 2002, and it was single-handedly written by the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi. However, the world and the region have changed in fundamental ways since 2002, and mega projects such as the GERD, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance, and rapprochement with Eritrea, developing ties with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, the rise of populism on the world stage, the immigration crisis, and the abortive democratic reforms necessitated such a shift. However, what Abiy gave us isn't a revision of the white paper and Ethiopia's foreign relations, but a continuation of his politics through war, a genocidal one at that. Ethiopia needed to recalibrate its relations with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries. It had better err on the side of caution than to recklessly precipitate a regional crisis by turning the region into a theater for great power rivalry between the US on the one hand and China and Russia on the other. The great power rivalry in the Horn of Africa points to the fact that Tigray needed to reach out to these powers strategically and tactically. It doesn't have to be hostile, whether in rhetoric or action, to the US, but it needed to seek out and pursue the support of American rivals. In addition to its allies, it made sense for Tigray to establish cordial relations with China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and Qatar. Abiy has already turned Ethiopia into a client state, despite the fact that it's harmful for Ethiopia to be viewed as having fallen in the pockets of the GCC. It's not in the tradition of Ethiopia's foreign policy for it to be so viewed. For good or bad, the Ethiopian psyche, which is so much affected by the legacy of struggles for its independence, fought fearlessly and ferociously by the likes of Emperor Theodorus II, Johannes IV, and Menelik II, would find that intolerable. Abiy's government will not last for long because his is a client state. Ethiopia's standing in Africa would also suffer if this were to happen. What might empower the country to succeed in avoiding this pitfall is effort to build its domestic capacity and strength, which can only be facilitated by the unity of its people. It's then that the country would be respected, and when even the most intolerant would be compelled, if not to accept, but to at least live with the country's sovereignty decisions. Unlike Meles Zenawi's, Abiy Ahmed's administration does not have a coherent foreign policy. His foreign relations aren't guided by any foreign policy white paper. He seems to be doing other nations' bidding so far, mainly before the start of the war. That was Trump's administration, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. One should be careful about judging his foreign policy by reading his book, Medemer. The last chapter in that book itself was plagiarized from EPRDF's ideological magazine of Addis Rai, published before he took office. No other event next to the war with Eritrea has had the effect of mobilizing the diverse ethnic communities of Ethiopia and served as a unifying symbol than the GERD in the country's recent past. And no other grand national project has been more maligned by the government of the day than the GERD. And its history has been misappropriated to glorify the incumbent. The GERD was designated to offer a symbolism for Ethiopian nationalism or renaissance. It was with that intention and in anticipation of possible Egyptian lobbying against funding by foreign sources that it was made to be 100% funded domestically and by selling bonds to diaspora Ethiopians. The days of project chief engineer Semenyo Bekele under suspicious circumstances, downgrading the number of turbines, allowing the US to insert itself in the negotiations with Egypt and Sudan, besides the decision to take Metec off the project, were all perceived by many Ethiopians as compromising the national interest. The most pressing question for most Ethiopians now is if they can regain the relative peace and stability they used to enjoy in the recent past during the 27 years of darkness, what Abiy calls the 27 years of darkness of EPRDF's rule. Never before in its history had the US State Department, I'm talking about the pre-war US administration, that's Trump's, had brilliant top diplomats on its Africa desk. Names like Thibon Meji and J. Peter Pham come to mind first. However, never before has such calibers been in the service of a populist imperialist administration, deeply steeped in transactionalist foreign relations. What worried me is their unthinking, blind acceptance of Trump's incoherent foreign policy towards the Horn of Africa. If it had a guiding principle, if any, it was the will to stop the influx of immigrants from the Horn of Africa region to the United States and the European Union. They are in charge of implementing it, they were in charge of implementing it without any hesitation. Ethiopia had become the first victim of that misguided policy under Trump. To borrow an expression from Richard Haas, foreign policy begins at home. Abiy needed to keep the house in order before he could engage in foreign relations. Ethiopia under Abiy has been a country coming apart at the seams. Tigray needed to find its bearing for its international and domestic relations from its regional interest. Thus, the beginning and the end and the alpha and omega of what was its policy since the coming to power of Abiy. Tigray needed to maintain its autonomy by all means necessary and to fend off threats to its right to self-determination. It was against this backdrop that the war broke out on the wee hours of the 4th of November, as the world was distracted by the Western world's most powerful political theme, the United States presidential elections. And it seems to me the timing was calculated. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki planned in advance to launch a massive offensive against Tigray that they thought could be completed before the new administration takes over office. If, in case Trump loses, and of course he lost, as he should. Gleaning from the speeches and communications of US diplomats under Trump administration as the war was raging, it seemed to me the war had Trump's blessing. What turned out troubling to everyone, including the West, was that the war ended up being genocidal, a total war. Mass atrocities, including ethnic cleansing, weaponized starvation, and sexual violence were committed against the Tigrayan population. In a spectacular turn of the tide, TDF has not only recaptured Mekelle, the capital, but also liberated large swaths of Tigrayan territories. Now the war has taken new fronts in Afar and Amhara regions. So I'll come to the end with this, and I would be happy to answer to any questions from the audience or from the members of the panel. Thank you for hearing.
Thanks, Alemayehu. Sorry, I think there's a little bit of noise in my background, so I'll ask the next question quickly, and we'll take questions at the end of the panel. The next question in our ongoing, we'll be still discussing the present, and this is for Samuel. And this question is: can you discuss the growing militarism in many of the countries in the Horn of Africa, and what can this be seen as a response to? And yeah, I think we've talked about a little bit of this already as well. So feel free to connect to other questions too.
Caleb, can I answer that question in tandem with the other questions later? If so, I would prefer to discuss the other questions before that. I guess the question about the relationship between the Eritrean regime and corporate mining companies. But the question in relation to militarization, refugee crisis, and conscription, I would like to discuss all these questions together. Yeah. So if you don't mind, if you can pass to other questions or other panelists.
Yes, you could discuss it, and I'll just read them quickly so the audience has an idea. So these couple questions, as Samuel briefly mentioned, one is the refugee crisis in the Horn has been exacerbated by war in the region as well as authoritarian leadership. Can you speak about some of the causes rapidly contributing to refugee crisis in your region of experience / expertise? And the other question Sabine and Samuel respond to is, mandatory conscription in Eritrea, as well as indiscriminate arrests by state officials, has resulted in the proliferation of mass jails and a devastating refugee crisis further exacerbated by immense hardship and torture in border crossing countries like Ethiopia, with the ongoing genocide in Tigray and in Libya. How has the current authoritarian leadership betrayed the hopes of Eritrea's 30-year struggle for independence? Yeah, you can take it away.
So I would probably take 10 to 15 minutes to answer this question, if you don't mind. And to just give a broader historical context, the current ruling PFDJ party in Eritrea had generally a progressive beginning, and it had progressive promises. I'm speaking about its history before independence. It had socialist credentials. It wanted to create workers and peasant paradise in Eritrea. It wanted to transform the socio-economic structure in Eritrea so that everybody can benefit from that. And the current state is a radical departure from the promises contained in its foundational political programs, in its foundational political documents. So, speaking about refugee crises and the militarization and conscription and how all these factors are connected, I would like to talk about 3 or 4 reasons why, or 3 or 4 factors that underpin the refugee crisis, which is huge. I mean, Eritrea is one of the top most originators of refugees, and since 2000, for the couple of decades, almost 500,000 Eritreans left the country to refugee camps in Ethiopia, to refugee camps in Sudan, and they have been crossing the Sahara to Europe. So, what are the underlying causes, and how do we read this crisis? And so the first reason that everybody, I guess, is familiar with is the widespread human rights abuse perpetrated in the context of indefinite national service program in Eritrea. This is one of the most the main reason, the main underlying factor for the refugee crisis, and everybody talks about this. There are other factors that everybody doesn't talk, and I will try to talk about that. But first, let me touch on this factor, on this reason. I'm not sure if the audience and yourselves know about this, but a UN Commission of Inquiry, which was set up to investigate the human rights situation in Eritrea, announced in 2015 that the Eritrean authorities have committed crimes against humanity, which inter alia includes crimes of enslavement, unlawful imprisonment, enforced disappearance, torture, persecution, rape, murder, in a widespread and systematic manner since 1991 in a bid to ensure control over the Eritrean population and maintain the ruling party's grip of power. The UN Commission identified the Eritrean National Service Program, which came into effect since 1994, with the expressed intent of passing the legacy of the Eritrean War of Independence onto the new generation, and which was aimed to strengthen Eritrean defense capabilities and impressing upon the young a sense of discipline and patriotism and organizing and mobilizing the population for development programs. At the main context, this national service program was the main context in which the Eritrean government perpetrates its regime of impunity and incarceration and what have you. Citing the ambiguous legal basis on which the duration of national service program was made indefinite and arbitrary, using national security threat and Warsaw Ikalo development campaign announced in 2002 as a pretext, the involuntary nature of the program, the national service program, where requests for release are routinely and systematically denied without any proper explanation and indication of remaining period of service, the forced employment of members of the program in economic development and private enterprises related to higher officials in a direct contravention of the 1957 Convention on the Abolition of Forced Labor, which prohibits the use of forced labor even for economic development purposes, the severe restriction of movement and religious observances imposed on members of the national service, the torture and killing to which members are subjected for breaking the stringent rules of the program, the dire consequence of the national service program has had over the family life of members. The Commission of Inquiry designates the national service program as forced enslavement due to all the factors that I have been listing, due to all these violations of human rights. The Commission, which was created in 2015, established that the Eritrean government had been committing crimes against humanity since 1991. The reason why I'm talking about this is because this is one of the main drivers of the refugee crisis in Eritrea. For a ruling elite, that is the PFDJ ruling party in Eritrea, which began its post-independence career with a vow to not to tread the road beaten by other post-colonial third world countries, and which, with messianic fervor and narcissistic self-adulation characteristic of so many modernist movements, declared in its 1994 National Charter, I quote, to perform miracles in peaceful nation building as we did in the War of Liberation. The Commission of Inquiry's report that it in fact has outperformed many post-colonial states in exposing its population to utter oppression and depravity comes as a devastating indictment. In some sense, the human rights disaster in Eritrea is a perversion of the modernist project the ruling party set out to implement. Like many of its kindred political movements, which emerged in the crucible of third world anti-colonial struggles with the aspiration of not only removing foreign occupation but also creating new modern societies, the ruling PFDJ party has made mass mobilization and discipline the central tenet of its ideology of nation building and modernization. As Tricia Redeker, Hepner, and David O'Connell aptly observed in their introduction to their book Biopolitics, Militarism and Development, Eritrea in the 21st Century, the PFDJ sought to rationalize the Eritrean society in the name of elevating poverty and backwardness and ensuring progress. Partly as a means to that end and partly as part of the end, the PFDJ has deployed all state instruments to invade, control, and if possible, mold even the most intimate provinces of its citizens' life. Taking a leaf out of the Leninist catechism of indispensability of a vanguard revolutionary leadership equipped with unparalleled insight into the present and messianic presence into the future, and in a spirit reminiscent of the civilizational burden the PFDJ gratuitously took upon itself, in the language of its national charter, I quote, the historic responsibility to pass on to future generations the basic elements of modern and just society. If one closely read the concatenation of element, if one closely read the concatenation of editorials, interviews, and seminars conducted by top PFDG cadres in the decade following the end of Ethiopia-Eritrea war, and that is in 1998-2000, and accompanying the declaration of the much hyped Warsaw Ikalo development campaign, one would encounter three persistently magnified leitmotif or themes. One is the need for prioritizing economic development over political system of the liberal kind. Examples such as the Maoist and post-Mao China, South Korea under the military dictatorship were invoked to, as an example, to drive home the importance of first securing bread over a liberal obsession with elections and political freedom. The second motive, leitmotif or theme in the propaganda machinery of the PFDJ in the post-border war with Ethiopia is the need for discipline, sacrifice, and constant vigilance and mobilization. The revolution era stoical forbearance was deemed very crucial for building the country, and citizens were called to make sacrifice in order for the next generation to bask in peace and prosperity. The third related theme is that which stresses the indispensability of the current leadership for the stability, security, and prosperity of the country. And all this I'm bringing to impress upon you how the widespread violation of human rights is logically connected with the modernization project led by the PFDJ, or at least its notion of modernization and creation of new citizens who are disciplined, patriotic, and morally attuned to the spirit of modernity and what have you. Mass indiscriminate arrest of thousands of Eritreans is also one of the things that are driving the refugee crisis in Eritrea. To give you a little personal example, my father currently, for instance, is in prison. He is 70 years old. He is diabetic. He has hypertension. And 2 years and counting, he has been in the one of the most notorious prison sites run by the military called Adabeto. And he hasn't been produced to the court of law. He hasn't get any legal representation. He is not allowed family visitation, and he doesn't know why he is imprisoned. He doesn't know when he's going to be released. And this is a typical example. This is not like a typical, this is not like an exceptional example. It is common for many Eritreans. You would ask random Eritrean, and you would hear a story of unlawful disappearance, imprisonment, and what have you. And obviously, this is one of the most notable reasons why people are leaving the country. The second reason, the second factor, which is not talked about a lot as a driving force for the crisis, for the refugee crisis in Eritrea, is the pauperization and immiseration of the Eritrean peasantry and Eritrean workers. You know, in its self-presentation, in its autobiography, and in the presentation of some leftist people, the PFDJ is presented as the defender of workers and peasants. You know, it is said to be its entire energy is said to be invested in uplifting the peasants and uplifting the workers. You know, unlike other African states, which are run by and for the petty bourgeois and the bourgeois and the urban centers. So this is the self-presentation of the ruling party in Eritrea, but in reality, if you look at the agrarian condition in Eritrea, if you look at the condition of the peasants and the workers, you would see through its policies, you know, that the peasants are living in a precarious situation, and this I hypothesize, or I think, is one of the main drivers of the refugee crisis in Eritrea. And I will read a little bit what I mean. I will explain what I mean by this, and how the Eritrean ruling party, the PFDJ ruling party, through its land policy, through its other economic policies, caused the pauperization and immiseration of the peasant population, and how this, in a bigger context, could be also one of the drivers of the refugee crisis in Eritrea. At the center of the mass exodus of Eritreans out of Eritrea is the pauperization and immiseration of the Eritrean peasantry. There are twin forces of exploitation that are creating the condition of precarity for the Eritrean peasants, namely the dual compulsions, forces of market forces, and the various forms of state-imposed extra economic coercions. The first form of exploitation, the dual compulsions of market forces, is the function of a differentiated access to vital production factors such as land, labor, and farm implements. Peasants enter into an equal and exploitative relationship with either the state or rich peasants to get access to one or all of these elements of production. The second form of exploitation, which is creating a condition of precarity, again I'm underlining this, is the extra economic coercion politically imposed by the Eritrean state or state-affiliated institutions such as the army, the PFDJ, the party as separate from the state. In a bid to accumulate capital, the Eritrean state claims in a bid to accumulate capital, it claims it needs to industrialize the Eritrean economy. The Eritrean government enmeshes the peasantry in a dense network of control, subjugation, and exploitation within and without the production process. The extra economic compulsions assume different forms, ranging from forced crop to forced sales of agricultural products, forced land alienation to forced cash contribution for various purposes such as helping martyrs' families, celebrating national holidays, and encouraging national sports, and finally, forced labor. Controlling the labor power, products of labor, and condition of labor of peasants thus constitute an elaborate and dense regime of state-imposed extra economic compulsions that suck the lives of Eritrean peasantry into the vortex of precarity and constant insecurity. In the name of expanding food production and generating the surplus necessary for industrialization, extensive tracts of farmland are being annexed, rivers are being redirected, and local ecosystems are being reconfigured by the state. Land alienation, development by dispossession. After Eritrea gained its independence in 1991, the Eritrean government issued a land proclamation that sought to transform the existing land laws inherited from Ethiopia. The latter was deemed obsolete, unfit for investment and development purposes, and responsible for environmental problems such as deforestation and soil degradation. The stated goal of the new land proclamation issued in 1994 is, inter alia, to assure agricultural and industrial development, promote or assure initiative and motivation among beneficiaries and producers, encourage private investment and initiative, avoid contradiction, friction, and dispute, and pave a way for the improvement of the living standard of the people of Eritrea. It declared, the new land law I'm talking about, all land, state land. This is a very crucial point. It declared all land, state land, and provided every citizen a use fact right to land for housing and farming. The consequential part of the new land proclamation that signaled a noticeable difference from the principles that informed the land reform the Eritrean revolutionary movements attempted during the armed struggle is the extraordinary level of power the law gives to the state to expropriate any land that it deems important for its objective of development. The law empowers the state to expropriate any land for purpose of urban expansion and development, capital investment, industrial, trade and tourism development projects, agricultural development including land, forestry, animal conservation projects, energy and water development projects, and other similar development and national construction programs. These have a significant negative impact on tenure, security of peasants, and even push a section of the Eritrean society, notably example for the Kunama and Afar ethnic groups, to migrate en masse to neighboring countries. The apparent emphasis the new land law put on the right of the state to expropriate any land at will in order to expedite modernization of the Eritrean economy through the appropriation of peasant surplus is symptomatic of the partial ideological shift the People's Front for Democracy, the PFDJ ruling party, made after independence. To be sure, the assertion of the centrality of the state in creating the necessary political, legal, and normative conditions for development and consolidation of an agro-export industry represents a partial refusal of the more orthodox proposition of neoliberalism, which foregrounds the primacy of private sector. The idea of the state as the primary agent responsible for development and modernization through monopolizing every national resource is not new to political forces with socialist pedigree either. Right from their earliest days in their career, the Eritrean revolutionary movement, especially the EPLF, which is a precursor of the PFDJ, had a vanguardist orientation concerning the issue of socio-economic transformation. So, in this regard, the Eritrean government's assertion of the prerogative of the state to expropriate vital resources, including land, was not foreign to its ideological orientation. However, despite the continuities, there are pronounced shifts in ideology, policy priorities, and class sympathy of the ruling party that has given the new land a particularly that has given the new land law a particularly anti-peasant character. While during the armed struggle before independence, the Eritrean Revolution, including the EPLF, trusted in the historical agency of the peasants and their leading role in the national life. After independence, the peasantry became important only as a source of surplus badly needed for leapfrogging the country to an industrial stage. This is evident in the National Macroeconomic Policy document the Eritrean government issued in November 1994. Apropos agriculture, the National Macroeconomic Policy document proposes transforming rain-fed subsistence agriculture into commercial agriculture through combined state and private investment. It envisions an accelerated program of commercialization, which is a very important point to my the bigger point that I am feeling I'm making, and enclosures with the aim of increasing agricultural production, supplying the new material needs of an emergent commercial industrial sector, and availing cheap food for the urban population. The post-independence land law made citizenship rather than kinship the formal basis of rights to land. It dispossessed the landed class and broke the social and political power of the dominant class that had previously constrained the emergence of new forms of production and exchange. However, by vesting all the land in the state, the law went further than simply redistributing the previous land tenure system. As a more centralized and coercive state power replaced the earlier decentralized form of rule and surplus extraction, the threat to tenure security was never far off. By nationalizing all the land law has in effect dispossessed peasants of their customary access to land and endowed the state with extraordinary powers to determine its allocation and use. It stripped local communities of their customary ownership of land and abolished institutions around the village commons that had historically afforded peasants some degree of security and protection. The inordinate power the land law gave the government would result in expropriation of huge amount of land for state and private-owned commercial purposes. The lowland part of the country, where pastoralism is the predominant agrarian practice, is the main victim of this policy. The government explicitly speaks of turning the lowland into sites for larger-scale export-oriented agriculture in many of its policy papers, and its sell-pitch to potential investors. Example of this could be found on the Ministry of Agriculture's Agricultural Investment Policy paper. So the state has taken a huge swath of land because of these reasons. The state has taken a huge swath of land for agricultural projects, and it's soliciting potential foreign investors to take up land for irrigated cultivation in the lowland region. It is difficult to find official information on the exact size of the expropriation and enclosures, but one can get a clue from the constant reporting of state media on agricultural projects carried out by the state-affiliated institutions, and the army. I am taking you to this extended discussion so that to show you how the state, through its land law and through other policies, try to, not try, but put the peasantry into precarious conditions, and how that creates very difficult economic conditions and push people outside the country and contribute to the refugee crisis. The second. Do I have time, Caleb? Am I okay, or?
Can I maybe stop for a second and ask Sabine as well to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sami. I think I can skip the part with climate change and agriculture, but just maybe for some of the listeners, 80% of Ethiopia's population survive actually as within this substantive economies. So they are farmers, and the agriculture is actually really important. So whatever irrigation we have, climate change, or that has a deep impact on 80% of Eritrea's population. And then, of course, if you don't have land that you can, or soil that is fertile, then of course that forces people also to seek new forms of land. I want to keep it short because I think we are only at the present, and I think we also want to talk a little bit more around the future aspects. So let me just highlight maybe 5 aspects really briefly that I think are really important to understand the refugee crisis in the Horn from an Eritrean perspective. And that will be ideologies of independence. I want to talk about militarization / incarceration, the political economy. Fourthly, this new generation that Sami has already talked upon, and what the diaspora has to do with it. For one, I think one has also to understand, for those maybe not familiar with Eritrea, that Eritrea is actually a new country that gained its independence formally in 1993 through a referendum. And it gained its independence as like this kind of almost David state against Goliath, which was Ethiopia, this huge, massive country that has now around 114 million inhabitants. So when Eritrea gained its independence, of course, for Eritreans growing up in the diaspora, the idea that they are Eritreans has been really strong. But within Eritrea, to actually foster this identity, national identity of being Eritrean, required a lot of work, right? Where we find in Ethiopia, this massive country, that they have turned to this kind of diversity and unity, to this form of ideology in order to foster or allow everybody in this huge country to find a common ground, which is to be diverse in a unified kind of setting. Eritrea went the other way and basically went for an ideology that was really about unity and excluding forms of diversity that are religious, ethnic, and even how people related, mostly saying that they come from certain villages, was almost forbidden. And the president at the time, which was the guerrilla leader, stylized himself as a guerrilla leader, because that's of course also comes with a lot of contestation. But Isaias Afwerki basically abandoned these ideas that you have villages by their name, but called them Zone 1, Zone 2, Zone 3. So you have a kind of remapping of Ethiopia as well around this idea to be unified. And one slogan in Tigrinya was Hade Hizbi, Hade Libi, one folk, one heart, one people, one heart. That kind of makes really clear that the idea was to move forward as Eritreans. And then later on, we find also this huge militarization, right? And the official reasoning for this militarization in the 2000s was basically to say the boundaries between Eritrea and Ethiopia have not been clearly demarked, and that's why there was a lot of conflict and the war came along. But we see until now this huge militarization. Even after the peace treaty, the border has not been demarked. There is no clarity on how both governments want to move forward. And so we know that the border war was not really about the border between Eritrea and Ethiopia, but what it did for perhaps the Eritrean authoritarian rule is basically to kind of bring all these young people into these military camps and militarizing them and indoctrinating them into Eritreans. Yeah, and so they had this kind of idea that you have the elders who were the revolutionaries and brought the independence, and you have this young generation that would be trained by these elders and has to go to the military camp that was called Sawa. And that was also the reason why the last year of high school ended up being in these military camps, which is basically somewhere in the desert, in order to kind of have this ideology of being Eritrean. And it also did work, because a lot of those people that end up fleeing feel also guilty of having betrayed their own country. They were born in the 1990s and don't know really a lot about what was there from beforehand, but they know that they're fleeing, and usually you see that when they arrive in Europe and when they have to explain why they left the country, they would also often say that it was more for economic reasons, rather than again that they are opponents of the government. But so the first point is really like we have to understand this kind of ideology of independence and Gedli, which is a Tigranian word for this kind of era of the 30 years of struggle to gain independence, and that people really feel one way or the other. And that's why you see also there's a lot of polarization within the Eritrean diaspora that are behind the government, because they think that this government has brought this independence, and people that feel that the government has actually betrayed its promise of revolution and liberation. So that is attached to this idea that there is actually no diversity possible in Eritrea at this day, because one has to be Eritrean, and that means that one cannot really talk about all these differences that one inhabits. And needless to say, there has never been any election, but that is tied with this militarization, and that actually no one has really a prospect outside of this, because every youth and even elderly men and women have to go through these camps and can be recruited as well. That means you find even 60-year-old Eritreans that have been patriots and you know have fought for the independence, being called back into these camps. Before the peace treaty, it was said because Ethiopia was this threat to Eritrea. Now it's more difficult. But as we see, and maybe we get to it later on, that Eritrea has managed actually to mobilize Eritrean troops to go into the northern region of Ethiopia and to fight wars there. But that's also, complicated to kind of figure out what then the motivations are behind that. But so we see that the idea of independence, or the ideology of independence, trickles down in really intricate ways, and what it means to be Eritrean, and what it means to do something. At the same time, then, if you find people that don't have any other perspective or possible future outside of militarization and always being in the service of the state, that they also seek futures elsewhere, right? And so we have seen a massive exodus of the youth, also rural youth. And I think what Samir said about the agricultural reforms is very important here also, to not only see it through the lens of militarization, but also to see it through the lens of agriculture, and not having this sustainable, fertile land in order to do things with their life, as well as having no other industry in Ethiopia, in Eritrea, to do something else outside of agriculture or militarization. So then the next point then would be actually to think about what kind of political economy do we have in Eritrea, and then it gets really grim, and because we don't see grounds that are disattached from the state and from the militarization of the state. So when you imagine yourself as a 20-year-old, and we don't even have to say 20-year-old, as a 16-year-old, the state really takes it into its hands what the future might or might not be for these youth. If you go to a technical college, you can go to a technical college, but that is always through the national service, attached to the national service. Whatever you do is being decided for you. So there's no outside, and that of course limits especially Eritrean men
when you think about family structure and wanting to provide for a family and not being able to provide. So we see sometimes that people get married and they are being called back for service. And what happens then to the bride, or all these things is really unsolved because they usually have to go back then to their own families. So even the family structure at this micro level has been infiltrated by the state. And the government is actually also really smart because they say there's an order to shoot at the Eritrean border, but really rarely people are being shot at the border. They're either incarcerated or they're being let go, which allows the state to do what it's doing without being worried about the youth revolting against the Eritrean government. I mean, government is a big word, but the Eritrean president or the dictatorship. So in the last point would then be, so how is that actually sustainable if we don't find any political economy that is actually working or that is only reliant on the military? So for one, I think Nisrin talked about earlier on about the European Union that has been, I mean, it has come to a halt, but has been supporting Eritrea in order to kind of put a halt to the refugees coming or entering Europe. At the same time, you have these these companies that are interested in extracting resources such as gold. But then you really also have the Eritrean diaspora, right? That is not only paying the government through 2% tax, but is also really supporting their own families. And so it's really the diaspora, and the diaspora, as I mentioned, is really torn. And it's getting, I think, with the Eritrean Ethiopian war, I think there are more conversations happening, and with the Yikal movement, basically fostering a dialogue between all kinds of Eritrean youth outside of Eritrea, we see an approachment, but usually the diaspora is really divided between being in the opposition and against the Eritrean government and supporting the Eritrean government because it has this self-reliant politics and it was this kind of anti-imperial power. At least that's how it was stylized in the struggle for independence. So I think, these are the kind of points that would allow us to understand why we see this mass exodus of Eritreans fleeing the country, but also currently trapped in these massive refugee camps in Tigray, and actually having to leave these refugee camps because they are at crossfire with the Eritrean troops and the Ethiopian federal forces.
Thanks, Sabine. That was a wonderful and detailed response as well. I think next I want to ask Nisrin a question, and maybe we could circle back to Samuel if there's any more thoughts. But the next question is, what is the current status of the Sudanese revolution? How have diverse actors from states to grassroots movements influenced its trajectory? And what are the next steps for the popular masses in shaping the future of Sudan?
Okay, thank you. I first want to just kind of commend the organizers of this forum for including Sudan in the Horn, because that doesn't always happen. And what that does for me is I get to learn to dialogue with people who, I think we need to have more of these kinds of dialogues, because part of what happens in these kind of designations where Sudan gets kind of not included in the Horn is that these are also colonial demarcations, right? Sub-Saharan Africa versus North Africa, the Horn, who belongs, etc. And as a result, we don't end up having conversations between people. And even for me as a Sudanese, I have a hard time sort of figuring out how to think about what is happening in the region from the perspective of people on the ground, right? Because I'm often probably being fed the sort of state line on it, if you will, right? So thank you. So shifting gears a little bit to the Sudanese revolution. First, I want to appreciate whoever formulated this question, because it implies that you don't assume that the revolution is over, as many might claim for strategic reasons. Yes, there is a transitional government in place that is supposed to move us towards democracy and democratic elections in 2024, but it's a hybrid government. composed of civilians and members of the security forces or military who were key figures in the former al-Bashir regime. And one of the central demands of the revolution was a transition to full civilian rule after 30 years of military dictatorship. So the revolution is not over. It's just, I think, moved, in my opinion, into a new phase with the radical elements of the revolution, the unaffiliated youth and feminist groups, the working class unions, the neighborhood resistance committees, the farmers unions, right, having largely been marginalized during this transition, even though they were and continue to be the backbone of the revolution, the ones who kind of carried it, if you will. Since the transitional government formed in July of 2019, there have been hundreds of popular protests, sit-ins, and workers' strikes across the country. You probably don't hear about them so much in the international media, but it's really been quite remarkable. And these protests or forms of civil disobedience are led by youth, by teachers, mining, factory and agricultural workers, farmers, and neighborhood resistance committees. And I'll just mention what they are. So these neighborhood resistance committees are essentially committees that formed in the 2000 teens in sort of cities and towns across Sudan at the neighborhood level, led by youth, demanding basically the provision of basic services. And they were then sort of radicalized through a series of kind of popular uprisings that led to the revolution. And so, these protests and worker strikes, et cetera, have been taking place against rising food and fuel prices, right? Around things like better pay and safer working conditions for workers, access to safe drinking water, the provision of electricity, adequate health services, and safe housing, particularly within the context of the COVID pandemic. So, for example, in August of 2020, there were 7 sit-ins in towns across the country, many of which lasted over 2 weeks, and they had a set of demands around sort of calling for security and stability, justice, and better basic services. And in most cases, people's demands were ultimately met by the authorities, right? In part, I think, out of fear that this could sort of spill over and lead to maybe another revolution. On the other hand, in March, or a second iteration of it, right? In March and April of this year, the resistance committees in several towns in South Darfur organized sit-ins until the government agreed. So they basically organized these sit-ins, again, around a set of demands centered around the provision of water, health, and electricity. One of them effectively shut down the local stock exchange, and it lasted several months. But in Darfur, many of these acts of civil disobedience are still being met with state violence. So these sit-ins have been violently dispersed by the same militia that I mentioned earlier. So, that I wanted to just kind of point out that contrast. We've had a record number of worker strikes as well since 2019. In November and December of 2020, the Port Workers Union in Port Sudan along the Red Sea went on strike in protest against moves to privatize the port. And those strikes were quite effective. The workers in the Kenana sugar factory, which is one of the biggest factories in Sudan, staged what is arguably one of the longest strikes in Sudanese labor history. I think rivals a railroad workers' strike in 1948, but it's, I think lasted over 33 days. And they demanded, among other things, improvements to health services in the company town, investment in education for workers' children, renovating the canteen, and the reinstatement of 34 workers who were fired for participating in the revolution. The company employs about 6,000 people, and it processes 400,000 tons of sugar a year and 80,000 tons of animal fodder for export, mostly to the Gulf. So it's a very important kind of factory for Sudan's economy. And so the demands were ultimately met in their entirety. And I give you all these examples to demonstrate that the revolution continues on the streets, at ports, and in factories across the country. So we see at the grassroots level, we see people continuing to demand a more just, equitable system based on socialist and democratic principles. But on the flip side, unfortunately, we see at the top an almost opposite trend, right? We're seeing a kind of continuation of the same tactics of repression used by the former regime to suppress dissent. We're also seeing Sudan open itself up to foreign investment and exploitation, really, in ways that are likely going to have a negative impact on the livelihoods and quality of life of the kind of popular masses. Sudan is really an example of what happens when neoliberal policies are touted as the answer to pulling the country out of deepening economic and political crisis. There have been numerous multilateral donor conferences pledging billions of dollars to support Sudan, but with significant strings attached. And so in 2020, for example, the government began implementing a number of structural reforms mandated by the IMF that are meant to address major macroeconomic imbalances and really to open Sudan up for foreign investment, especially since they've been removed from the list of state sponsors of terrorism. And I should mention that this removal was tied to Sudan agreeing to normalize relations with Israel in exchange for increased US investment in Sudan's agricultural and technology sector. The irony, of course, is that in 2017, the Bashir regime received an IMF report that essentially told them that they needed to implement austerity measures. And so shortly before the revolution, they started implementing and removing critical fuel and food subsidies based on these recommendations. And these measures were implemented somewhat unevenly to hit rural and peripheral areas harder than cities, in part because they feared, they sort of underestimated the power of rural people and peripheral, people in peripheral areas to kind of rise up, if you will. And that ultimately is what led to the perfect storm that triggered the revolution. So it's not necessarily the cause, but it was, contributed to the trigger. So what are the next steps? My hope is that this government will recognize that it is the people of Sudan and not its external donors and foreign investment partners, that need to shape the country's future and determine what direction it should take next.